Ornithology on the African continent is as ancient as Africa itself. Africans used their traditional and indigenous knowledge and perspectives in collecting and recording ornithological perspectives. With the scramble for Africa by Europeans, ornithology on the continent moved away from indigenous knowledge to white ornithologists named as collectors, even if they lifted no finger in shooting and preparing the birds. Europeans used scientific theories to drive ideas of racial superiority when they colonized African states. African men were only ever used as assistants to white ornithologists, even though they had long been a part of birding culture in their respective countries. These assistants were rarely mentioned in the official state archival records. Saul Sithole, like many African men of his generation, was defeated by colonialism and apartheid. Information on birding in Africa is solely ascribed to white men, regardless of how much the likes of Saul Sithole, Matthews Matabate, Ali Safi, and others contributed to this unfamiliar and important scientific knowledge. They were still just useful natives in a noble profession reserved for white honor and prestige. Sithole spent more than 60 years of his life at the Transvaal Museum, now called the Ditsong National Museum of Natural History, more than half of his life as a birder and in various capacities, yet no history books, nor books about ornithology in South Africa mention what his skills contributed to ornithology and anthropology. As the world changes and more people are embracing their history with no political restrictions, more and more stories of our society's hidden figures are unearthed and are being given space in the mainstream. Saul Sithole is one of the hidden figures whose story of scientific knowledge in ornithology deserves praise and honor. This book tries to honor his legacy and celebrate his decades-long career in ornithological work in Africa. It is also a love letter to the many men and women in South Africa and on the African continent whose stories of courage were muffled by decades of injustice, exclusion, and dispossession. Good evening and welcome to the virtual launch of The Forgotten Scientist by Lorato Trok. This book tells the story of Saul Sithole, the black scientist who was never acknowledged as a scientist. Saul Sithole gave 62 years of his life to the Transvaal Natural History Museum, serving under notable white scientists like Herbert Lang and Austin Roberts. However, history had forgotten Saul and his contribution to our understanding of birds, mammals, and hominids until now. My name is Andrew de Block and I'm the AV Tourism Project Manager at BirdLife South Africa. BirdLife South Africa is the country partner of BirdLife International, a family of organizations in over 200 countries concerned with the conservation of birds and their habitats. As AV Tourism Project Manager, part of my job is to help develop and promote relevant resources for bird enthusiasts. It is my absolute privilege tonight to join Lorato Trok in conversation to discuss this very important book. We're grateful to Carol Broomhall and Jacana Media for approaching us to host this event. It really is a pleasure and a privilege. Good evening to you, Lorato, and welcome.
Good evening, Andrew. Thank you for having me. My pleasure to be here.
Now, before we get started, if you in the audience have any questions for Lorato during this event, you're very welcome to interact with us via the Q&A box function. The chat box is also open for any comments, but please do type any questions you'd like addressed tonight into the dedicated box. We will address these towards the end of the evening. And if you're going to use the chat box, please make sure to select the all panelists and attendees link to make sure that everyone can see your messages and not just us. If you're watching tonight's event on the BirdLife South Africa Facebook live stream, you can also post comments and questions in the comments feed there and we will monitor them. Also, we're going to be doing a live giveaway this evening of a copy of this wonderful book. This will be a randomly generated name out of those in attendance on Zoom tonight. So please note that you will not be eligible if you are watching on Facebook Live. You must tune in on Zoom. Let me now introduce our special guest this evening. Lorato Trok has more than 10 years experience in publishing, writing, and story development in children's literature. Lorato is a qualified teacher and librarian who started her career working at Robert Moffat Library in her hometown of Kuruman, Northern Cape, for 4 years. Lorato was also a project coordinator at the Centre for the Book in Cape Town, a project of the National Library of South Africa for for the award-winning First Words in Print project for 4 years, a project where children's stories were created with input from publishers in all 11 official South African languages and distributed across the country to homes and schools. In 2005, Lorato was invited to help launch the Reading Africa reading program at the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library in Washington, D.C., as part of the celebrations of Black History Month. Lorato worked as a publishing program manager for 6 years at Room to Read South Africa, an American-based NGO. One of the books she published for Room to Read won a prestigious UNICEF Best ECD publication in 2011 and 2012. She was also an editor and project manager at Schools Publishing at Oxford University Press. For 4 years, she was a South African, Lesotho and Zambia country coordinator for the African Storybook Initiative, a digital publishing platform for children's stories across the African continent. She's contributed a number of stories in English and Setswana on the website and translated more than 100 children's stories into Setswana. She is a published author and in 2017 published a children's storybook, Mokhao's Gift, through Book Dash. She's also published 2 children's storybooks through Room to Read South Africa. She holds qualifications in language and literature, majoring in creative writing and advanced editing. She's presented papers locally and internationally on children's literature. Lorato, it's my absolute privilege to welcome you tonight and to share the stage with you. That really is a glittering CV that I got to read out there. You clearly have a passion for storytelling and for books. So please tell us a little bit more about the journey that you've been on to get yourself to this point, especially considering you coming from a background of children's books.
Yeah. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you everyone who has taken their time to join us this evening. My name is Lorato Trok, and as you have heard, I come from a small town in the Northern Cape where people think that nothing ever happens in the Northern Cape, in my small Kuruman town. And, you know, stories have always been a part of me, even though I didn't grow up with a lot of books around in my home, or there wasn't even a library where I was growing up in my neighborhood. But we, you know, my mom used to tell us stories at home. We grew up on Setswana oral stories all the time, you know, when I was growing up. So I don't think at that time we recognized that that was promoting literature, or we regarded it as literacy. We just thought that we were having fun because there were no TVs, there wasn't much to do, there was political turmoil and all that. So, and I think for me, that was how I came to love books. And I've always loved reading and books and the spoken word. And I grew up around languages. I mean, my dad is Namibian and he spoke Ovambo and Afrikaans, but because he didn't know any Setswana, he spoke a lot of Afrikaans. So I grew up in a multilingual, in a bilingual home. But then the uncles who came to my home as well were speaking various languages, somewhere from Zambia, from everywhere across the continent. So multilingualism was always around me, and I've always loved listening to languages and all that. But for me, it was always about early literacy, children's literature, because there wasn't anything that I wanted to read when I was growing up. So I thought that as I grew up, I would want other children to have something to read, especially with people who look like them. Because when I was growing up, I never had any book with illustrations or written by people who look like me. It wasn't until I was 15 or so when I came across Maya Angelou's book, and that was the first time that I was introduced to a Black woman author, and I never stopped. I mean, most of my reading is on, you know, Black women's writing and all that, and early literacy as well. I make sure that I read a lot of books by Black female authors around the world. So I have been a children's author for quite a while. I've actually written about 17 children's stories. Most of them are picture books. So this Saul Sithole book is the second book in my series of unsung heroes, that maybe we'll talk about that later. And this is just the first time that I'm writing for young adults, but for the most part, I write picture books for children in Setswana and English.
So maybe Lorato, tell us a little bit more about the series of books. How did you get involved in telling these unsung heroes stories?
So with the unsung heroes, I just thought, what happened was that when I was working at some schools in Attersville as part of the African Storybook project, I was working at a school in Atteridgeville, and there was a teacher there named Rosina Sidibani Mudiba, but I didn't know anything about her. And the librarian kept nagging me and telling me that, do you know this woman? I said, I don't know her. She told me her name, and I said, okay, what about her? And she said, she used to be an athlete, in the 1970s. And I really didn't think much about it. And then she was just so shy about her story. She didn't say much about it and so on. And then later on, she told me a story that she used to run, in the 1970s and so on. And then I said to her that I'll write your story. I only got the time in 2017 when I won the Anfasa grant as well. And I was forced to write Rosina's story, and I wrote the story. So for me, it was the fact that I did not know anything about Rosina Sidibani Mudiba, this black woman from Atteridgeville, who was the very first black woman in the country to run with white athletes in apartheid in the 1970s, actually, and win multiple, and actually set multiple records and win multiple times and beat white women. But, she shamed the apartheid government so much that they refused to give her a green jacket. She actually only got a green jacket in 2013 when Fikile Mbalula was the sports minister. That was the only time that she was honored for all the work. And there's actually a school named after Rosina in Lodium, in Pretoria, in the suburb of Lodium in Pretoria. It's a sports school. And I was just fascinated, and I was thinking that how did I not even know about this woman? How did I go through the whole schooling system without knowing? And how is it that our children, even today, go through the whole schooling system without knowing about these people? And I just thought that I made it my mission that I'm going to be writing about this heroes and heroines in our country, and say unsung heroes, because when I was talking to people doing my research as well, no one knew about Rosina. No one knows about Saul Sithole. I did not know about Saul Sithole until Professor Nancy Jacobs introduced me to the family, and I said to her that I'll have to write a children's story or a story for a book for young adults about Saul Sithole, and that's how I came to know. Otherwise, I would not have known about Saul Sithole, and I mean, when I read about his story and learned about what an amazing, amazing human being he was, he gave so much of his life. I was just thinking that there's something wrong in our country where we don't celebrate people that have done a difference. We are focusing on people that we shouldn't be focusing on.
Yeah, that's an amazing task to take on. I'm really looking forward to getting my hands on that story about Rosina and the rest in the series as well. But let's talk about Saul Sithole. We've talked a little bit about his involvement, but maybe for the advantage of those who haven't actually read the book, maybe just tell us briefly who was Saul Sithole and why is his story so important to tell?
Like I was saying, that Saul Sithole's story was so important. I was so ashamed that I did not know anything about the story, because I've never read a newspaper article, and I read quite well. I read all the time, but I've never come across Saul Sithole or anything like that until I met Prof. Nancy Jacobs. And this was just amazing, amazing Black scientist who in the 1930s, 1920s, he started working and gave 62 years of his life to the Transvaal Museum. It was called Transvaal Museum then. I think it's now called the Ditsong Natural Museum of History in Pretoria. 62 years in ornithology and paleontology, and he had only a standard 6 education. That's today's grade 8. But he had just a natural flair for science. And if it wasn't for the appalling policies of apartheid, Saul Sithole would have been one of the best scientists that this country had ever produced, because a lot of his work, the skinning of the birds, the taxidermy, all the work that he did in ornithology, it wasn't only for South African museums. His work is in museums in Britain, in America, in Chicago, in cities in America like Chicago and New York and in all these countries. So he's not only a South African hero, he's a hero for the world. He has done so much for this country that people don't even know about him and what contribution he has done for the science in the country.
Yeah.
And we need to tell stories like this. We need to document all these stories about Saul and Rosina, the likes of Saul and Rosina, that all of us, I'm not writing this for children in the township. I'm writing this story for South Africans, all of us to know what we have, what our history have.
I think it's absolutely so important that we have a balanced account of people's contributions, and Saul is an amazing man. I'm not going to give away too much from the book, but his story really does warrant being told. And I'm so glad that we can bring this to this BirdLife audience of birders and nature lovers so that they can hear these stories. I want to read a couple of excerpts here, just to contrast the way that you describe Saul Sithole and how he was described by some of the white scientists who he worked with. So there's a quote here by Austin Roberts writing in his diary. Lang is training the boys to make good skins. Saul is far better than the other skinners and is doing very fine skins. Very matter of fact. Another one, this native, by his ready willingness to render himself useful and by his good example, assisted in maintaining an excellent discipline and great industry among the skinners. It's this very old way of talking about people. And then I just want to read out a paragraph here of the way you describe the way that Saul worked. So he was an expert in using fine steel, cotton wool, alcohol, and arsenic. He would read vigorously to learn about the trade of skinning and preserving birds shot in the field. Sithole would learn the same techniques his superiors learned, honing his technical skills on the job and gaining his bird skinning skills on expeditions where he could observe living birds. His work with specimens was equal to no one and very precise. So I think just the way that those different excerpts are written, it's almost a perspective of being looked down on by the white ornithologists who are, saying, well, he's doing very well for a native, whereas you taking that and flipping the perspective and saying, no, this man was an exceptional human being regardless of the color of his skin. So I think what I'm getting at is this. I consider this a work of revisionist history, revising the way that we look at our history, and in this particular instance, the development of science in South Africa. But revisionist history is a hot topic in South Africa, as we all know, whether we're talking about changing road names, airport names, pulling down statues of colonialists, people with questionable legacies, and the naming of popular buildings and institutes across the country. How do you find that your book and your series of books fits into this whole narrative?
Yeah, I mean, revisionism in South Africa, what we know is that, especially when we started just during the first years of the first decade of our democracy, when the government was trying to rename schools and so on, that people were up in arms. And what is always interesting is that people who are up in arms, they always invoke poverty, saying that, oh, the government should have used the money for poor people. I mean, we all know that they don't really care about poor people. All they want to do is to keep the status quo. And it's very important that we do look forward, but we look also backwards from where we come from. And it's important that we change. Otherwise, we are never going to move forward as human beings or as a country. And we cannot be walking around getting into buildings that has got names that don't reflect the population of the country. Where is Saul Sithole building anywhere in the BirdLife or in paleontology? Nothing, absolutely nothing. I mean, when I went to the museum, I mean, I'm not saying anything bad about the museum. I'm just saying when I went to the museum and I went to the Austin Roberts room, the bedding room, I was just so sad to not see any sign of Saul Sithole or anything about Saul Sithole, even though he had contributed so much, I'm sure, so much what is in that room. But there's absolutely nothing. I have no idea why there isn't anything that is celebrating Saul Sithole when he has given 62 years of his life over there. So it just feels like you want to be stuck in things and have things remain the same when life is really never ever going to remain the same. So it's one thing that, I mean, I also would like we are here at BirdLife South Africa. Now we know about Saul Sithole. Maybe we can challenge you to have a bird named about Saul Sithole. Who knows?
Yeah, it's such an important thing for us, as you say, to not just look forward, but look backwards and look at where we've come from and acknowledge those who, by default of our history, just haven't had the limelight and the spotlight and the appreciation that they should have. So I think this book goes a long way towards revising that part of the history, and we all need to be aware of it. And that's why I say get this book and educate yourself on the story of Saul. And there's so many stories out there, so I'm glad you're writing them.
So many stories out there. I mean, even when I was, reading the story of Saul, Nancy Jacobs' chapter on Saul Sithole, and coming across all these other names, it wasn't just him. It's only that he's the one who, he was very good. But there are so many of them, those Matabates and all these other people, the other Black people who were doing all this great work. So it's a lot of them that we haven't actually celebrated. This is what I'm just writing about is actually nothing compared. I thought that I was just maybe going to write 3 or so books in my series, but I don't think so. I think I'll have to go on. There are so many people that I'm coming across.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting time in South Africa. I think we're starting to get to a point where these stories are surfacing again and people are acknowledging them. And I think people are, from a birding point of view, this year, or it might have been late last year, saw the first ever publishing of a bird book in Zulu. There'd never before existed a field guide for Zulu speakers, and it's the first African language that we've had this published in, which is a landmark thing. It's amazing that we're finally, but only in 2020, 2021, getting to the point where Zulu speakers can talk about birds in their own language, but it is exciting that it's happening.
It's very exciting, and I can tell you that, I mean, growing up in the Northern Cape, when people, a lot of us, when we were growing up, we used to have names of birds, and do you have birds names in Setswana? We have names when we see a bird and we see, one bird and say, this bird is bringing rain, there's going to be rain is coming when we see a certain bird. So there are those names in our language. It's only that there hasn't been, investment in, science or scientific word in our languages. There isn't scientific investment for our languages to grow in that field. And that, so there is, and it's exciting that at least we are starting with isiZulu, but I think we can do better.
Absolutely. As you say, it's exciting that it's happening, but there is so much more to do. I'm going to change tack slightly and take us to the USA. So the US has had quite a few historic moments recently for African Americans particularly. We had Barack Obama, the first Black president. Now we've got Kamala Harris, the first not only woman VP, but also first Black vice president, as well as first South Asian vice president, as a mixed race vice president. And we've had, for example, the first Black senator in Georgia was elected as well. So a lot of big moments in the US. In South Africa, we've made a big deal of people like Sunita Ahmed, for example, captaining the Springboks and being a role model in what's considered still quite a non-traditional role for a Black South African. How important is it to have the stories of Black heroes told, and how important is it for people to feel represented, especially in South Africa, where the Black population is in a majority, but we still don't know these stories?
Yeah, and you know what? It's very, very important. I mean, I always relate my own story, as I said in the beginning, that when I was growing up, I really didn't know that Black women can be authors, or I've never come across a book that was written by a Black woman until maybe I was in my teens when I came across Maya Angelou, and I never looked back. And I remember how excited I was about reading a book that was written by a Black woman. I mean, even though she was American, but her story, when I read her book, I know why the cage bird sings, it's so much related to what was going on in our country as well, and what we have heard about our country. And I know how happy I was. And I know that every time when I read books that are representative of my life or the life that I have lived, or I live as a Black woman, a Black person in this world, it opens up a whole lot in me. And I think that it's not only for us as Black people to read books that are written by Black people, it's for all of the people, because so much that is going on, what we are seeing, especially in the US, where, you know, they keep on saying they are the world's best democracy, but the things that we see going on there with Black people, Black bodies lying on the streets and so on, and all these things, and people just defending the indefensible, because all they want to do is to keep the status quo, that whiteness must prevail. And it's a shame that in South Africa, not even more than 30 years after we've had a democracy, people still want to gaslight us and say, can we just move on and forget about what happened, or let's move on. But how do we move on when we don't even know half of the story of our country, when maybe more than half of the population doesn't even want to know what happened to our country, because people just want us to move on? So representation very much matters. And it's just a shame, even now in schools, when for some of us who have children who are still in primary schools or in school, when they bring back books from the library from school, and you see the kind of books that the school has, it's just a shame. They don't have the books that our children can see themselves in. And I remember my daughter, she was about 8 at the time, and I wrote to her school principal and said that my daughter is bringing these books all the time home, and I don't like what I'm seeing, because the books are just not what I want her to read. And they just made my life difficult, and I had to take her out of the school because they were just starting something that I didn't want to be part of. So that's what happened. It's just a concerted effort that people are really don't want to transform. And we have a long way to go, and we cannot sit back here and say we are going to move on. We cannot move on without being uncomfortable or making people uncomfortable. It's okay to make people uncomfortable, because for some of us, our lives have always been uncomfortable, and we have never found comfort in anything.
Yeah, it really is so important. Representation seems like a small thing, but I think someone like you succeeding and writing books can inspire a young South African who hasn't considered this before, because, as you say, that you've never seen anyone that looks like you do this thing. So, talking of Saul Sithole as giving representation to Black South Africans in science, there was a recent academic study in South Africa which was very, very controversial, and I don't want to get into the reasons why, but the study looked at the difficulties facing attracting Black South Africans into the sciences, particularly biology. So Saul Sithole's story is evidence of the barriers and blocks that exist for Africans entering the sciences. But when Saul was a young man, it was obviously impossible for him to become an academic scientist or biologist because of the Bantu education system. As you say, he only had a standard 6. And also, of course, the limits placed on Blacks during apartheid. But things are very different now to what they were in 1920, yet we still seem to be struggling to get Black South Africans entering science and the STEM fields. So what needs to change in your mind in order to make science more mainstream and accessible in South Africa?
You know, when they always talk about not attracting Black students into science and all this, I just think that, you know, it's an excuse. It's an excuse. What have universities done to attract those students? Not for them just being universities, waiting for these students to come to their universities and register and saying, we don't have a lot of them. Have they done anything to make sure that there is development from the bottom before they come to the university? Have there been investment from corporate South Africa that want to attract Black scientists to the schools or to their corporate offices and say, we have this many? I think that people just want to be comfortable and just complain and say, we can't attract them, we can't attract. How? Where you have a country where more than 80% of the population is Black, and you are going to just sit there and say, we can't attract Black students to our universities. What are you doing? How have you invested in that development? Because there are plenty of bright children in township schools, in rural schools, plenty of them. So many of them, they don't have the opportunities. They don't even, I mean, look, only 5% of schools in South Africa have got school libraries, 5%. And we all know where that 5% is. It's not in rural schools, it's not in township schools. So if the schools don't even have a school library and a functioning school library and a school librarian, do you think the school will have a functioning laboratory? It will not. It won't have. And how will these children be scientists? By just going to university and study science when all their schooling life, 12 years of their schooling, they haven't seen anything that represents science. And all of a sudden you want them to come to your university and say, we have attracted so and so many Black students in our science faculty. It cannot happen like that. We have to invest. We have to make sure that corporate South Africa invest, because this country is for all who is living here. We are not going to be living in, you are not living in some place. You can be living in a very well manicured place and then think that you are safe there. It's not. Everything that happens in the rural areas is affecting you who lives in some other place that you think that it's far from that, because we just one big place in the world actually. So we need investment. We need investment. We need, I mean, look, like now you're talking about this isiZulu dictionary. It's a start. We can go on. We can have all these other organizations that can sponsor a child being interested in, look at Saul Sithole, what happened to me. I'm just thinking about Saul's family. You know, when I was talking to the family, and, you know, Saul's daughter, Zondi, knew everything about her father's work. She knew everything about ornithology and fossils. She could name things and all that. And if it wasn't for those policies of apartheid, she would have been also one of the best Black scientists, female scientists in the country. When I was doing my research talking to Temba, who is Saul Sithole's great-grandson, he has kept his great-grandfather's work and all those things that he, you know, as family heirlooms. And he knew so much about them and so on. And I'm just thinking that, I mean, what would have happened to this family? It would have been a generation of scientists just coming from this, you know, family, learning about science and ornithology and paleontology and so on. But there was a missed chance.
Yeah. Yeah, the foundational ground-up approach is really what has to change. If, as you say, if a young South African has never encountered science or a laboratory, they just don't know that they can enter these fields. And without role models like Saul being known about and having their stories told, it just isn't even a possibility. And it's very sad to think of the Saul Sitholes that we're losing because people don't have these opportunities.
Yeah.
Not just in sciences, but, you know, across medicine, law, all these important parts of society, and we're losing that potential.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to change tack again. So here's a slightly different question. I'm interested to hear your answer because it's a current debate in the birding community. And just recently, we've taken a decision to change two of the bird names. They used to be called Hottentot buttonquail and Hottentot teal, and now we've changed them to Fynbos buttonquail and bluebill teal. What do you think Saul would have thought of the use of words like Hottentot in birds' names, and what is your opinion on changing these names now retrospectively?
Listen, Saul was born in the early 1900s. So I think for him, when I say, for example, they give this bird a name in 1920s called Hottentot, I don't think that at that time they would really just say, well, why do you say Hottentot? It was just, they were just like you were reading that excerpt, it was just the natives and boys, and they had no say. I'm sure they would have no say. But for somebody who, if we have people now in the science world say you and BirdLife and all the other young people who are working at BirdLife South Africa will just stand up, because we need people to stand up and say this is wrong. We can't still be having these names in South Africa that we all know that they are hateful to some population of our country. Let us have a name, a bird named after Saul, Matthew Mathabate, Ali Safi. Now people will want to know who Saul Sithole is, who was Matthew Mathabate, who was Ali Safi. Let us do that. Well, let us name a building after them at the museum or some place where his legacy will continue to live on. And then we always want to know, when a building is named after somebody, we want to know what was his contribution, what was his or her contribution, what has he done to have a building named after her. Then people start wanting to dig up on their life story. So let's do that.
Yeah, I agree with you. And the natural extension from now getting these two names changed is to look at the legacy of some of the people that birds are named after. It's often the European white ornithologists who people like Saul served under and did such good work, who are named after the birds are named after them. But when you look back at some of these people's legacies, you really start to question whether we should be celebrating some of those names. There's some pretty damning stories out there about some of those early naturalists, especially.
Yeah.
So I guess, what is your opinion on naming birds after people like that?
And some of them didn't even lift a finger. They didn't even lift a finger. It was the likes of Saul Sithole and the Matthew Matabates and all these other black assistants who were doing all the work, and not them. They were just telling them this, and they were doing all the work. But I mean, they will, as white men, they will just have this. They were considered more superior and smarter than the natives and the boys who were just supposed to be assistants and so on. We know the story. We know the story. We have seen that. We have heard that. We have read that all the time. And I mean, I'm saying, if we have right now, what the world has changed so much throughout. If you still live in the past, you really are not going to survive in this world, because if you're still wanting to hold on to names or things that happened before and one still want to justify them and say, but it was then and this is now, even if you were a bigot then, we don't want your name. We don't want your name splashed on the buildings that we are going to be going in and out. We cannot be celebrating you. We want to know all about your bigotry and racism and all the other stuff that you did. You don't deserve adulation at all. At all. We need to know stories of people who preserved, who against all odds, like the people like Saul Sithole and the Rosina Sidibanis of this world, who toiled under very difficult circumstances.
So you kind of touched on it, but what is your ultimate goal for this book? Is it to inspire Black South Africans? Is it for revising South Africa's history, to tell untold stories? What is your ultimate goal for this book and this series?
It's a bit of all that. It's a bit of all that. For me, with the series, I want to bring forth the names or the lives of people who really were exceptional in what they did, especially during the time when being Black was just, I don't know how they survived. I mean, I cannot imagine how it happened. Saul Sithole in the 1900s and Rosina in the 1970s and all those people. So I want to bring forth those stories, and I want to show that South African history is broad. It's not just, because I think we really at the beginning, especially when it started when we came, after 94, our history was really told with the lens of a politician. It was all politics. It was all about people who were coming back from exile. It was all about people who gave their life to the struggle and all that. We just never heard about people like Saul or Rosina who stayed behind and did all these other exceptional things that are not talked about, or they don't really have names that evoke all this sentimental whatever about what was going on in the country at the time. So for me, I want to show that our country is much bigger. Our history is much bigger than just politics and political figures. We have heroes and heroines within our own communities who we don't even know. I mean, when I was doing this book, there are so many people, the neighbors don't know what these people have achieved. People who come from these neighborhoods like Mamelodi and Atteridgeville, they didn't know anything about these people. You go to the library in Mamelodi, they don't know anything about Saul Sithole, nothing. There was absolutely nothing. So, and all that, and also the stories like Saul Sithole really is an inspiration for young Black scientists to look at what happened to him then and what they have now, that, you know, their life is so much better today than what Saul has and what he has achieved then.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of all those things.
Yeah, I think it's a really wonderful and very important project, and we need more stories like this to be told. I'm just going to read one last excerpt here before we start rounding up the formal questions. Just about Austin Roberts. You mentioned that he was one of the ornithologists at the Ditsong Natural History Museum who Saul worked under for decades. Now, for those of you who are birders listening to this, the Roberts Birds of Southern Africa is the go-to ornithological text and bird book in South Africa. And that Roberts name is venerated and associated with, you know, quality and good work. I'm just going to read a paragraph here. Austin Roberts is synonymous with birding in South Africa and advocating for indigenous understandings of bird behavior as a useful tool for collectors. His Birds of South Africa, published in 1940, was the most successful book in ornithology and features names of birds in African languages. Roberts was not without controversy. He intimated that Africans, whom he called observant natives, understood birding through superstition and nothing else. Sithole accompanied Roberts on collecting trips to Vryburg, Grahamstown, and a 6-week expedition to Zululand in 1932. Roberts was so enamored to Sithole that he wrote glowingly about his work in all his reports, one of which was a February-March 1933 report, where he wrote, "Native assistant Saul has continued his useful assistance in cleaning skulls and remaking badly prepared skins for birds." But Roberts did his best under, I guess, the circumstances of the country at the time to give Saul credit. But even here, you see that Roberts hasn't acknowledged that Saul was a translator on his trips. Saul was his cultural guide through Zululand and helped save their lives on an expedition where he was being threatened by locals. He was a team leader for all the native assistants. Saul was a leader in that team and was so much more valuable to Roberts than just preparing skins. And we all know the name Roberts. No one knows the name Sithole until now. So I think it's just as well that this has come out, and I do, again, this is the book, The Forgotten Scientist, and I do recommend that people go out and get this and read it and educate yourselves and hand it among your friends. Where can people get the book, Lorato?
People can order the book from Jacana Media. They've got the book, and the book also is available in all bookstores. If you go to your exclusive book or you go to any bookstore, please do get your copy. And if you don't get a copy, if they don't have it at your exclusive books, tell them that you want it. They can send it so that they can see that there's a demand for it. So even if they say at your branch that they don't have it, ask them that you will wait for it. They can order it for you and you'll get it there. Also, if you can Google Jacana's offices and call their numbers, and Biblionef as well, and you can buy the book from there. We still don't have, Jacana is still working on the ebook. We don't have an ebook at the moment for our international audience.
Yeah, I believe that ebook is in the works and the rights are being secured. So we look forward to having that in ebook format. And for those of you who are watching live on Zoom tonight, when you do exit the webinar tonight, it will take you to the page on Jacana Media's webpage where you can order the book as well. So if you are feeling inspired and want to learn more about Saul Sithole and his amazing contribution to ornithology in South Africa, the link will take you right there. So Lorato, I'm going to give you a bit of a break, and we're going to welcome Sunita Ahmed to share a few words with us. So Sunita, you can turn on your video and unmute yourself. Sunita is the General Manager at Biblionef, which is an organization that supports the development and distribution of educational storybooks. And Sunita is going to tell us a little bit more about the role Biblionef played in making this project a reality. Thanks, Sunita.
Thank you, Andrew. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be part of this launch. BiblioNef South Africa is a non-profit company that aims to promote a culture of reading amongst children by donating new storybooks in the 11 official languages. To this end, we can provide new we can provide new quality storybooks to children in their home language. The books we donate are skillfully selected to meet the specific needs of our beneficiaries. We ensure that most of our books are locally produced and written, and they contain beautifully illustrations and stories that children can relate to. We support children and youth between the ages of 3 and 18 years who do not have access to home language books. These children must be part of an organization that has an educational focus. Example, the primary schools and the high schools, ECD centers, and any other children's organization providing educational support. This ensures that there is accountability for the books once it is donated. When funding allows, we also provide teacher mentoring and coaching sessions to foundation phase teachers alongside our book donations to ensure that books are optimally used. You can visit our website to view our online resources and look at the various ways teachers and caregivers can teach the children on how to write and read for meaning. We are thrilled to have commissioned the publication of this book, The Forgotten Scientist, The Story of Saul Sithole, with Jacana Media and with the funding from the National Heritage Council. There has not been enough research done on yesteryear's Black heroes, and we will lose these stories and do our history a disservice if this is not adequately documented. We are extremely proud to be part of this project, and we applaud Lorato Trok and Jacana Media for bringing the story to the forefront. Late last year, we received a total of 3,000 of the printed books in 6 languages. It's available in isiXhosa, isiZulu, Sesotho, Sepedi, Afrikaans, and English. We are excited to continue donating this wonderful book to schools and children's organizations in 2021. And as Lorato said, it's also available for sale from our office, and any funds raised in sales goes back into our organization to donate more books. For those of you that's looking to our website, you can find us on www.biblionef.org.za. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sunita, and congrats, and thank you to Biblionef as well as the National Heritage Council for supporting such an important project. And I really look forward to what the collaboration between you two as well as Jacana Media and of course our author Lorato Trok as well. I'm really excited to see what comes of this series of books. Thank you for those words from Biblionef.
Thank you for having me.
All right, the next item on the agenda before we get to your questions, I see there's a few in the Q&A box, is to announce tonight's giveaway winner. So I'm going to ask Melissa to bring up our slide here, and our winner this evening is Unkemetse and Teta. Well done, Unkemetse. You're going to get a copy of this book. We have your email address from your registration, so we will hand that over to Jacana to get that book to you. So congratulations, well done, and enjoy it. Fantastic. So we're going to do some open question and answers here, Lorato. There's not too many of them, so we'll get through them quite quickly, I think. There's one from Normalizo. Normalizo wants to know, well, first she says, thank you, Lorato, for bringing these important stories to our attention and shining a light on our forgotten heroes and heroines. Her question tonight is, how has the process of writing these books changed you personally?
Yeah, it's a great question, Normalizo. And I think for me, when I started writing these stories, I realized how little I know about our country, our history, and I read a lot, but I still didn't know. And I just thought to myself that I'm not going to stop. These are the stories that I want to write. I'm going to be writing them. So it has changed what I read and what I want to write. That is what has happened to me. I'm really just striving to bring these stories and these voices of these voiceless people to the fore, to the mainstream, so that a lot of other people can do. And I'm still going to be doing a lot of research on other people that I'm going to be writing about. This is not the end.
Yeah, there's a question asking about, who else are you going to mention? Which other experts in their fields are you going to do next? Are you allowed to tell us that?
Well, yeah, I'm actually talking to, well, I've been writing about this lady. I'm sure some of you know you. I mean, she's been around. I've been talking to her since 2016. Oma Katrina, some of you know her, the old lady who, she and her 3 siblings, I think 2 have died last year, and it's just in the world who can speak the new language. So I've written articles about her, but I'm writing a story, a book. It's part of this series that I'm writing about. So yeah, I've got a few people, and I listen to what other people are saying out there. I want to go to every corner of South Africa. I want to go to Durban and write about somebody else. People can just suggest names, and I will go out and do my research and write about these people. These are the stories that I gravitate towards. So yeah, my next book will be about Oma Katrina.
Fantastic. I look forward to reading it. And there's a comment here by Farouk Mangera. Farouk says that he knows of a man called Hamilton Naki, who is a gardener turned self-taught surgeon. And he suggested that's a story that needs to be told. Yes. And that we as South Africans must talk up all of these stories and biographies. It really does make a difference. So there's another suggestion for you.
Yes, I thought about Hamilton Naki, yes.
Yeah, he's a fantastic man and a really amazing story as well. As you say, there are so many of these stories out there. I'm sure you've got a long list.
Everywhere.
That's great stuff. Well, I wish you the best in getting through them all. Then there's a question here for me, apparently, from Krista. Krista wants to know if BirdLife South Africa has programs for children, and would it be possible to share this book with them as they get excited about birding? So we do. At the moment, our children's program is mainly run out of our Wakkerstroom Center for Tourism and Education, which is just outside the little town of Wakkerstroom. It's a birding hotspot for those of you who are bird enthusiasts. We do have children's programs in that area. We also have our community bird guide project, and a lot of the community bird guides that we've trained in these rural communities play leadership roles in terms of conservation education and that, and they have a lot of kids birding clubs in local schools. So certainly there's a network here from BirdLife South Africa's side that we can make use of and distribute these books. So I think maybe Sunita, you and I need to chat about using BirdLife's channels and getting that book out there. So thank you for that question from Krista as well. I think that's pretty much it in terms of questions here. Although now I see there's one in the chat box here from Yvette. Lorato, Yvette says, good evening and thank you for this fascinating talk. I wanted to ask if hearing stories in a spoken rather than a written form in childhood has informed your writing.
So I didn't get that, Andrew.
So Yvette wants to know if hearing stories, so spoken stories rather than written stories in your childhood informed your writing at all.
It actually did. It did. A lot of it. Actually, my whole work in illiteracy, I actually think that it was because I heard stories all the time. Because literacy is so manifold. It comes in so many different ways. It's not always about writing. I know that for children, seeing text is very important in literacy development and so on. But in cases where that is not an option, hearing stories is just as important. So I heard a lot of stories, and I also read a lot of stories when I was able to get hold of the book. So that was, but for me, I always attribute my writing to hearing the stories. I mean, I cannot imagine where I would have been if I didn't hear anything related to stories and storytelling. So that was what built that. My foundation was oral storytelling from my family as I was growing up.
Yeah, there's such a lovely tradition in this country of oral storytelling, and it definitely has its role to play. But as you say, from literacy point of view, having having books written down and read by kids is also so vitally important in making sure that they have quality education and can break those barriers that Saul got stuck under, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So absolutely, I think it's a great question. Now, I actually want to know if you've gone and maybe done any readings of this book for young adults or interested groups. I think it'd be fantastic to hear you actually read through.
Yeah, it'd be great. I love reading. I can do that. I can do this. So what I'm also planning to do with my series, because this one is for young adults, I'm planning to write it as picture books for the little ones as well. So, you know, for the 4 to 8 year olds. The series that I write here, that's what I want to do as well. Picture books with the series.
Yeah, that'd be really nice, especially some stories lend themselves very well to visual storytelling.
Yeah.
You can reach a whole new demographic that way. That'd be a great idea. Yeah, I think maybe an audiobook is on the cards as well.
Yes,
all sorts of plans and potential in this project.
All sorts of potential. The government must fund us.
Yeah, these are stories that need to be told.
There are so many stories that need to be told in this country. So many stories we know. I mean, when I was starting to write this series, somebody was saying, you know, there's a story about my neighbor who did this and this and this. My neighbor also did this and this. My neighbor, I heard these stories about my neighbor as well. So there are so many stories. So many.
It could be a lifetime project, this. I think you've unlocked something amazing.
Certainly. Certainly.
And we wish you the absolute best. Lorato, I think that brings us to the end of the evening. All that remains for me to say is thank you so much for, number one, taking this project on. I think you've done an amazing job. This really is a wonderful book. And I think you're limiting yourself in saying that this is for young adults. It's written in beautiful, simple language. It's very readable for people of all ages. I've read it twice already, and I really enjoyed it both times. It's very simple. It's a short read, under 50 pages, and I think it's such an important story for people to hear and to internalize and take on as South Africans in our journey forwards as a country. So thank you, Lorato. Thank you to Jacana Media for giving BirdLife South Africa this opportunity to host this launch of this very auspicious book. And Lorato, all the best for the rest of the series, and thank you for coming on tonight.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you to BirdLife. Thank you, everyone, for taking your time to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Lorato, you make us really proud, and I see there's a lot of very positive messages coming through in the chat box. If you would like to put another message in the chat box for Lorato, we're going to leave the Zoom room open for a few minutes. That is the end of the official proceedings. Melissa's going to put on some music for us in the background, so please don't leave. If you want to, you can sit and enjoy it with us. But we're going to log off for now. So thank you everyone for attending tonight, and it's a good evening from me, and good night.
Thank you.